new decks. It's what we've all wanted since the beginning of Dominaria United Standard. And we got new deck. We did, in fact, get that. We got mono black and pretty much nothing but mono black. But now we've had about a week and a half to play this standard, and tournament results are pouring in, and it turns out that not every single deck at every single tournament is mono black. It's most of them, but there are, in fact, some decks that aren't that. So let's take a look today at 3 of the jankiest decks you could be playing in standard right now and still win some games.
And I'm your favorite Magic Channel's favorite Magic Channel. Best believe that the professor go bananas for my deck techs. I come correct like a porn star, slicing up all these other suckers with my sword mark.
And we're back. Hey, thanks for tolerating this camera angle for one video. We're going to be looking at decks in just a second, but in the meantime, have you identified everything on my desktop? Let's hope so. Now, the SD card that goes in this camera right here, this very nice Sony camera, is broken. We have to get a new SD card. Yes, I only have one. Please leave me alone. We came to talk about Magic, and that's what I intend to do. We're going to talk about 3 decks today that are not mono black, but that's not the only thing they got going for them. They're also very cool, at least in my mind. So let's go ahead and start looking. Now, let me be upfront with you about this first pick. There is black in this deck. I didn't say that none of the decks would have black in them. I just said none of them would be mono black. Now, this one I think does differentiate itself from the mono black decks in the format in a number of interesting ways, and I think it's also well equipped to deal with those decks. Now, this does have some familiar cards in it, things like Sheoldred the Apocalypse. I think we're all pretty familiar with this thing by now. It's also got Evolved Sleeper in it as a 4 of. Some decks will play 2 to 4 of this card. It's getting pretty common nowadays. But it's also got 4 Invoke Despair, which is one of the cards that I hate the most in current standard. But this is not just some normal mono black deck that's playing like Liliana and Tenacious Underdog. Note that neither one of those cards are in this deck. They're not even in the sideboard. Instead, this deck is trying to cast Invoke Despair, yes, but it's trying to copy it with Twinferno. One of Twinferno's modes allows you to copy your next instant or sorcery, so bang, you can hit them with 2 Invoke Despairs for the price of 7 mana, but this deck has a few ways of ramping into 7 mana really easily. Now, if they let your Shakedown Heavy through and decide not to let you draw that card for combat damage, boom, you can get through for 12 damage pretty easily by choosing the other mode on Twinferno that gives a creature double strike. You could also use Twinferno to give Sheoldred double strike and just deal 8 to your opponent out of nowhere. There's a lot of cool stuff this card can do in this deck, and it can even copy an Invoke Calamity if it's not copying an Invoke Despair. Now, Invoke Calamity is usually going to try to copy or recast an Invoke Despair out of your yard, but I imagine if you can Twinferno an Invoke Calamity, you can do some really disgusting stuff. Now, this deck does some cool stuff against mono black, first of all. Mono black tends to have a creature and a planeswalker out a lot of the time, so Invoke Despair is actually good against its own deck some of the time, but there's some other stuff in here like Riveteer's Requisitioner. We just played this in mono red on the streams, and the whole point of the mono red deck was to do well against the mono black deck, and we chose this as one of our important 2-drops in that deck. It did work there, and it does work here, I'm sure. If you want to, you can just sacrifice this to a Liliana, very obvious, very often. It's going to be the only creature you have to sacrifice to a Liliana that comes down on turn 3 on the other side of the board, but that's fine because it pays you a treasure token, and this deck does want to ramp. Requisitioner ramps us, as does that Sushi when it dies, another thing that's pretty good to sacrifice to Liliana if you have to sacrifice something. Fable of the Mirror Breaker is some ramp. And once we have a reflection, we can copy things like Riveteer's Requisitioner to get more treasure out of it. We can copy Shakedown Heavy to get more cards, or we can copy Atsushi, and even though the copy immediately goes to the graveyard, that's fine. It died. We can draw cards off of it or get more treasure, whatever we want to do. So the reflection has a lot to do here, but mostly we're using things like this and Big Score to ramp us, draw us into the important cards, and then play things like Invoke Despair. And because of all that treasure we got laying around, we can Twinferno and double it up. And if the worst thing in the format right now is Invoke Despair being cast on 5, just imagine what 2 Invoke Despairs being cast on 5 feels like, and I feel like this deck is pretty capable of doing that. A couple of cool things about this deck to note is that it plays 61 cards. I don't know if you've noticed this up here yet, but that is 61 cards. They only have room for 23 lands. They are playing 24. Adds up to 61, but aside from that, this also won the Saturday Standard event that it was in and went 4-0, not losing a single game. So if you kind of like playing mono black, but you're getting a little sick of it by now, this is a nice little transition to go to. You don't have to play those Lilianas or those Tenacious Underdogs anymore, but you still get to play some really cool cards and you get to do some awesome combo stuff. Imagine if you do copy that Invoke Despair with a Twinferno and you have a Sheoldred in play. You're going to be gaining a lot of life, drawing a lot of cards, and dealing a lot of damage. feels good. Now, the next deck that I want to look at today is actually mono white control. It turns out that the answer to a monocolored control deck is another monocolored control deck some of the times. Again, we had good success with big red, and apparently big white does okay too. This actually is a color right now. It has a fair amount of strong cards, whether you're talking creatures or removal spells or what. You know, this deck gets March of Otherworldly Light and Fateful Absence and Depopulate, all great removal spells right now, and it even gets to leverage Banishing Slash, I should say, because it's got a few artifacts here or there, and a number of enchantments like Wedding Announcement, which is already a pretty popular and powerful card. This is not seen play. The whole time it's in standard, people have been playing it. There's a reason for that. It provides at least 2 or 3 creatures, some card advantage in mono white sometimes, which is not something you see every day. And then eventually the Anthem effect. It's just an all-around strong card, and obviously we're going to keep seeing this till it rotates, but we also play Restoration of Iganjo. This is to make sure that we get, our 3rd or 4th land drop, really our 4th land drop. It ramps us a little bit in mono white, which is, again, something you don't see every day. It can get back cards like Spirited Companion from our graveyard, or we can dump them into our graveyard and play them for free with Restoration. And it's also pretty nicely sized creature that leads to more creatures. With things like Wedding Announcement, Restoration, and Spirited Companion in the deck, I'm actually surprised to not see a single copy of Sarah Paragon in the entire 75 here, because these would be really nice 3-drops, especially Restoration, to get back with a Sarah Paragon. But obviously did well enough here at Community Tourney. This deck went 5-1. So obviously, pretty great success. I believe this deck came in 3rd in that event. But, on to the parade of amazing cards that Mono White has access to right now. We've already talked about Depopulate, Fateful Absence, and March, but maybe the best card in Standard is the Wandering Emperor. I shouldn't even have to show you the text box on this. It's likely that you played against this card 100 times at this point, just this season alone. But the Wandering Emperor, again, maybe in the top 3 or 5 cards in Standard. And it can swing the game all by itself when it does come down. So no wonder they're playing 4. A mono white control deck is mostly going to be based around leveraging this card. And obviously, we're going to play the full play set. But we also have Elspeth Resplendent. Now, I said that we don't play Sarah Paragon in this deck, and I'm a little surprised by that. But Elspeth Resplendent can come down and get anything off the top of our library that a Sarah Paragon could save, which I think is kind of neat. Again, things like Restoration, Wedding Announcement, Spirited Companion, and stuff. This can just nab off the top of our library and draw us a card in the case of Companion, ramp us in the case of Restoration. So there's a lot of really cool things about just Elspeth's -3, but we have plenty of creatures in this deck that we can +1, and it turns out a +1 is actually very, very good a lot of the time. There's also a full playset of Sanctuary Warden, sort of our end game in this deck. Sometimes we'll mess around and just kind of control the board state and kill them with a Wandering Emperor they can't deal with, or maybe a second Wandering Emperor they can't deal with. Sometimes we'll play an AO, more on that card in a second. Sometimes we'll just, again, control the board state and kill them with a Reckoner Bankbuster we can finally crew, but for the most part, Sanctuary Warden is going to be the thing that leads to the most in games. This is yet another creature, or card, in mono white that draws us cards. Note how many things we have that do that. Spirited Companion draws a card. Sanctuary Warden draws a card. Reckoner Bankbuster draws cards. Restoration is a form of card advantage, and Wedding Announcement, again, straight up draws cards. So this is a mono white deck that has, more ability to draw cards than the average blue deck because of all the tools that White has gotten in the last few sets to help them at least maintain card parity, right? A lot of the cards in this deck, you'll play them, they'll leave your hand, and then they'll pay you a card back. Wedding Announcement will usually pay you a card or 2 back. Spirited Companion pays you a card. Sanctuary Warden pays you a card. So you're never super up on cards. You never have 6 or 7 cards in your hand, but you very often have 4 or 5, and that's a very good place to be for a lot of mid-range decks in this format. And this, obviously, could have the ability to grind out certain decks. Let's talk about this versus Mono Black, You play Spirited Companion on turn 2, and you draw your card, and you kind of don't care that you have to sacrifice this to a Liliana. You almost want to if you have a Restoration of Iganjo in your hand, because you'll play Restoration on your turn 3, you'll go get a basic land you put in your hand, and then the next turn, you just get your Spirited Companion back and draw another card, which is really nice, because if that Liliana's still over there, it's ticking up, it's making you discard stuff. So you can discard more Spirited Companions to get back with Restorations or whatever you want to do. This deck has an interesting wrinkle or two against the Liliana decks, and when they do drop things like Sheoldred and whatnot, You've again got Fateful Absence to take out both Lily and Shelly. You've got March of Otherworldly Light to do the same, so or at least take out the Sheoldred, right? So again, just solid removal in this deck, along with decent creatures that can end the game and plenty of ways to draw cards. A classic mid-range deck that even gets some tricks, like Roadside Reliquary if you're looking for another way to draw cards. You got a Reckoner Bankbuster and a Wedding Announcement. You can sack this to draw 2 cards. Another reason I'm a little surprised not to see Sarah Paragon in this deck, because it would be very good with a Roadside Reliquary. But either way, not questioning choices. I just really like Sarah Paragon. But even without Seipei, this deck was a 5-1 beater in its Community Tournier format, or in its Community Tournier tournament. So this is actually one I kind of keep my eye out for, and I'm not sure it's going to be popular moving forward in this season, but it looks like one that could pretty easily get you to Mythic if you learn how to play it. Crossfade transition, we're back. I'm sorry that my screen is much lighter now. I apologize, mole people. I am one of you, but the last thing I wanted to look at today is not from a recent tournament, but it is a deck that went 5-0 in a standard challenge on Magic the Gathering Online. Now, there's actually a lot of these to point out. There's a 5-color Joda Humans deck that went 5-0, but you've probably seen lists like that. There's a mono blue Tolarian Terror like Haughty Jin list, but you've probably seen lists like that too. This one you may not have seen yet this season at least, but it is a holdover from last season because it's effectively a fight rigging deck. But the cool thing about this deck is that it's not just a fight rigging deck. This is like a fight rigging / Simic ramp kind of Simic mid-range pile. This deck is doing a whole lot of different stuff, but almost none of it is something that you think it would be doing, right? This deck is not playing Joint Exploration, for instance, the new Simic ramp like Preordained mashup that's post-Hermagia Growth Spiral. All that kind of stuff is right out. We're just playing solid creatures in here that can do some beating regardless of whether or not we have a fight rigging, and just some decent cards. You know, we got like 2 Fading Hope in here for some removal. That's about it, but there's also 4 Make Disappear in case we don't play a 2-drop, and the deck does not have a whole lot of 2-drops, so you're pretty safe to run Make Disappear in this slot and just crush Lilianas that try to come down on turn 3 before you played your 3rd land, so that's pretty nice. Aside from that, though, we got Commune with Spirits in here to help find our fight rigging, which is nice, or conversely help get us to, 3rd and 4th land drops, which are important in this deck. But we've got things like Reservoir Kraken. This is a 6/6. If we play Fight Rigging on 3 into Kraken on 4, we can pretty easily get a free Titan of Industry off of our Fight Rigging that same turn, which is still pretty good in this environment. Titan of Industry, in case you haven't seen this guy in a while, it's still a very, very good card in the sea of mono black and mono red and mono blue and all the decks like that. If you resolve a Titan of Industry and it hits the table, turns out you're still in really, really good shape, and this deck can do that as early as turn 4 with a Fight Rigging and a Reservoir Kraken. Now, we don't have a whole lot of other ways to get it on turn 4, but we do have things like Tovolar's Huntmaster, which creates 10 power when it hits the battlefield, and if it ever flips over, creates a ridiculously hard to get over sort of board state. It's very hard for your opponent to win through an attacking Tovolar's Huntmaster that's flipped, but aside from that, Topiary Stomper provides some ramp and gets big once it's time to do that. This is also a creature that doesn't immediately proc Fight Rigging or anything, but at the very least it gets to a 7-power guy in just a few turns, right? Aside from that, Llanowar Loam Speaker also provides a little bit of ramp for us and can get our land swinging. Brarbridge Tracker is a 4-power creature, so again only takes a few turns to trigger Fight Rigging the way we want it to. And this is also a form of card advantage. This is a deck that wants to get to its important cards. It wants to get to Fight Rigging, wants to get the Reservoir Kraken to trigger the Fight Rigging as quickly as possible and all that. And the card advantage that Brarbridge Tracker gives us makes sure that we have bodies on the field and ways to dig to the important cards, and I like that. Reckoner Bankbuster, kind of the same as Brarbridge Tracker, as draws us cards and is also a 4-power body some of the time, and it's really easy to crew in this deck. There's a nice trick where you turn your lands into a creature with Llanowar Loam Speaker, and it's a 3/3, so it can crew your Reckoner Bankbuster without actually having to attack, which is nice. Nice little trick with Loam Speaker there. Aside from that, though, this deck is mostly just looking to hit Fight Rigging into a Titan of Industry, but if it doesn't do that, it can just ramp into the Titan of Industry, which is still nice to resolve. Or it can just win off of things like Reservoir Kraken and Tovolar's Huntmaster along the way. So I really like this deck in the way that it sort of attacks the format from a few different angles, right? Are we a ramp deck? Are we a mid-range deck? Are we a sort of tempo deck even with the Fading Hope and the Make Disappear and all that? And depending on what you play against and what you draw in your opening 7, you can play like any number of different decks. And that's kind of a neat way of looking at things, especially when on the surface it's just a fight rigging deck. But when you actually start to shuffle out hands with it and play some games, it turns out it can take a lot of different forms depending on what you're playing against and what you have in your hand. But hey, that's all the decks I got to talk about for this one. Yeah, we're back to Rakdos combo in the background. Can you tell I really like this deck? I do. It's very, very evil. If you're going to cast Twinferno in this standard, this is probably the best way to do it. But that's all the decks I got for this one. Let me recenter myself in the, just under the eye of Scaled Worm there, as I always am. But that's all I got for this one. Hey, check me out on twitch.tv/SBMTGDev. You want to do that? If you want to see me play games of Magic, aside from that, you can check out some of these other videos on the YouTube channel, like the recent deck tech we just did. Great opening bit, if I don't say so myself. Usually think my stuff is bad and not funny, but that one's almost funny. It's getting there. So check that one out, and check out the recent gameplay for Big Red if you want another janky deck that can take down Mono Black, and we prove it in that video. Aside from that, follow me on Twitter at SBMTGDev. You can check out the Patreon at patreon.com/SBMTG. $1 a month to vote on content. That's why we're doing this video. Link in the description, just like everything else. And join us next time where we'll talk about how to beat Esper, because that's the actual best deck in the format. In any case, I'm done for this one. Just let me know how you felt about this thing down there in the comments section. And if you've found any like weirdo janky decks that went like 6-1 in a tournament that I somehow haven't seen, then make sure you share links to those in the comments section. But also make sure that you're very careful when hitting links in the comments section. But that's all I got for this one. So I'll catch you cats later. I am Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.